Welcome to the 7th Africa-U.S. Forum for 2024, South Africa's new Government of National Unity, Optics for Global Relations. These monthly programs feature speakers from around the African continent and from here in the U.S. Today, actually for the first time, all of our speakers are in Africa. So that's a first. So we have fewer people here in the U.S. this time. This forum is on the record and is being recorded. Video will be available on demand later on the USC Africa US website, where you can also find video of all of our previous sessions. Our next forum will be Monday, August 26th at the same time, and the topic will be intergenerational solidarity and African health. You can see the list of forums for the entire year, all of the calendar 2024, on our website, and we'll also put the link into chat for those of you joining us on Zoom. These monthly forums are presented by, in alphabetical order, the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Wekesa will be joining us in a moment. The Annenberg Center for Communication Leadership and Policy at the University of Southern California, my affiliation. The Center for African Studies at Howard University. The Institute for African Studies at George Washington University, and the Public Diplomacy Council of America. And we begin, as always, with our co-convener, who has done so much to make this series come alive, Bob Wekesa, USC's inaugural Africa Fellow and Director of the African Center for the Study of the United States. Bob, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thanks, colleagues, participants, for attending today's event. This is the 19th event that we are having. 19th discussion since we established the Africa-US initiative by the partners that Adam did mention. Since then, we have expanded the initiative not to include only universities and particularly centers for African studies in the US, but also think tanks, non-profit organizations, government officials and policymakers, with the idea of expanding and expounding on Africa-US relations in an increasingly multipolar world. In fact, as we speak, I can see our colleague Krista Johnson from the Center for African Studies at Howard University joining us. This far of the 19 events that we've organized since December 2022, we've just touched on so very many topics, ranging from climate change and energy security, to governance issues on the African continent, to issues of press freedom, media, and digital technologies. But of all these discussions, one major area studies topic has remained with us. That is South Africa-US relations. And this rides on the fact that South Africa is one of the more important relations between Africa and the US more broadly. In fact, some have gone as far as suggesting that South Africa is in fact a swing state, because in its own right, it is an African power, a global power. Sometimes people say it punches above its weight. And if we just look at the key geopolitical issues, we find that indeed South Africa is a global partner, global power rather than just being one that is relates with the US on its own. And therefore, today's discussion focusing on South Africa-US relations under the circumstances, under the context of the new Government of National Unity, the first since the last one collapsed in 1996 in the dawn of South Africa's democracy. So with this in mind, and let me just also add very quickly that initially we only undertook what we could call talk shops. So we'll just discuss and let matters pass. But beginning this year, we've started producing reports for every event that we host. Those reports are on our website at the African Center for the Study of the US at the University of Witwatersrand, and you can access and engage with some of the discussions we've had in the past. But we look forward to the discussions today. There's just so very many geopolitical, foreign policy, international affairs discussions that relate to the GNU or the Government of National Unity and what it means, its implications for US-South Africa relations going forward. And back over to you, Adam. Thank you.
Thank you. And Bob, we have, I see 4 speakers already logged in and ready to go. And I believe you had a selection for who should go first.
Thank you, Adam. Our colleague, I should have mentioned this, our colleague Priyal Singh from the Institute for Security Studies based in Pretoria is not able to join us. So allow me to vary that and invite my colleague Stephen Gruzd from who is in fact the Deputy Director at SIA, South African Institute of International Studies, in charge of governance and diplomacy. So over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Bob. I hope everybody can hear me. And thank you for the promotion. I'm not the Deputy Director, but I'll accept the promotion that you've just given me. I'm a program head. Thanks very much to Adam and to the team for inviting me, and I look forward to making a few remarks. I mean, the topic is looking at the government of national unity. This is not the first time that South Africa has experienced some kind of power sharing in this way. You'll remember in 1994, the National Party went into coalition with the ANC, even though it was not a constitutional requirement and the ANC had enough votes not to need a government of national unity. It only lasted for 2 years. We've had a number of coalition governments at provincial level, what you would say state level, in our in many of our 9 provinces. Some of them have proved durable, others have collapsed quite quickly, and we've seen that phenomenon especially at local level. As ANC support has dissipated at local government level, we've had these multi-party coalitions, and they survive as long as they do, and then when it becomes politically expedient for 1 or 2 parties to topple the coalition, that's what happens. So we're in very early days in this national coalition that we have now, the government of national unity. I'm not going to rehash the whole results of the elections, which is old news by now, but the ANC did not get a majority. In our proportional representation system, it got barely above 40%. This meant that it would have to go into coalition with someone. And its choice was to not just bring in 1 or 2 parties. They interpreted the election results as saying that the country wanted a multiplicity of parties. Well, that's what they said. And so there actually are 11 parties in the government of national unity, some of which you would have heard of, and I'm sure some of which you would never have heard of. The 2 main partners being the ANC and the Democratic Alliance, the DA, in terms of their numbers, but also bringing in the Inkatha Freedom Party, the Patriotic Alliance, the Good Party, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the Freedom Front Plus, the United Democratic Movement, Al-Jamaa, Arise Mzansi, and UAT, which I can't remember what that stands for. But part of the thinking, I think, by the ANC was to dilute whatever power the DA would be coming in with, so that it could not demand more ministries than the ANC wanted to give it. And so in the end, after a lot of horse trading, the Democratic Alliance ended up with 6 ministers of agriculture, basic education, communications and digital technology, home affairs, and public works and infrastructure. Now, none of those are really major power players in the foreign affairs field, with the exception probably of home affairs, which has to deal with migration. There were also 6 deputy ministers. South Africa has landed up with a very big cabinet. Sorry. I also have a bit of flu, so I will be taking sips and trying to keep my voice. South Africa has a very big cabinet, over 30 ministers and over 40 deputy ministers. And part of this is patronage politics, is satisfying different constituencies. In terms of DIRCO, the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, that has stayed with the ANC, but we've had a change of minister. Naledi Pandor was in the job for about 5 years, and she retired. and was replaced by our Justice Minister, former Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development, Ronald Lamola, who is quite young. He's 40 and has moved up through the various ANC structures, having started life politically in the ANC Youth League. Wow, this is harder than I thought, so excuse me. We also have two deputy ministers in Alvin Boertes, who was the same deputy minister with Naledi Pandor, and also a relative unknown called a young lady called Thandi Moraka, who made her name in one of the outlying provinces, but she's not very well known as a national figure. So the key question is, does this government of national unity mean a big change in South African foreign policy? I think the answer is going to be no. We may see a difference of approach. Pandor was renowned for wagging her finger and lecturing when she didn't like something. I expect Lamola to be a little bit more measured. But if you're expecting major changes on our policy towards Russia and Ukraine, or indeed the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think you'll probably be disappointed. Lamola was one of the ministers who went to The Hague when South Africa brought its genocide charges against Israel at the International Court of Justice. He appeared there. He's intimately involved in that case. And those sentiments will continue into the new administration. Also to say there are two very important committees. There's the Foreign Affairs Committee within the ANC and the Foreign Affairs Portfolio Committee in Parliament, both of which, obviously for the first one, but the ANC still remains strong and well represented in Parliament. And so while the other parties, many of them didn't really have a foreign policy plank in their platforms, and were more interested in domestic issues. But the DA and the ANC have certainly been at odds over issues like Ukraine and the Middle East. But the extent to which that's actually going to change policy is not clear. What we have seen is some strains in US-South Africa relations, particularly because of the stances that we've taken on Russia, claiming to be non-aligned, but taking actions which suggest otherwise, including military actions with China and Russia over the anniversary of the invasion in 2023. The exercises took place. But it was very interesting to see that the deputy minister, I'm not sure how much time I have, Bob, but the deputy minister in an article penned around the AGOA talks said, "We don't condone Russia's military intervention in Ukraine, which has violated international law." And it took a long time to try and get Durko to say that. They said it on the day of the invasion and not since. So I find that quite significant. I think the government of national unity is going to get a bit of a honeymoon period. I'd be interested to hear from the Americans around the table whether there was any splash from Parks Tau, our Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, who's also an ANC politician. He has just been in the States for the AGOA forum. What sort of splash did it make? I think it was probably hit out of the headlines by Netanyahu's speech to Congress, and of course all of the drama with Joe Biden pulling out of the race and Kamala Harris's campaign, which is getting going. So I think there will be a bit of a honeymoon period, and I'll end this section by just reminding you that Congress has a request for the government to thoroughly review South Africa's relations with the US to see if it should still be eligible for AGOA, and using its words, its association with malign actors, which are countries like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, probably others as well. That has passed the House Foreign Affairs Committee. It's not reached the Senate floor, and it has not obviously been signed into law by President Biden. But that's worrying South Africa. And in fact, at least 4 delegations from my count, including this last visit by Parks Tau, have gone to the US to try and explain South Africa's position. And, we're not sure always whether these politicians have met the right people, whether they've had the right impact, but the relations remain somewhat strained. I think most South Africans would prefer a Democrat in the White House. If it's another Trump presidency, it's anybody's guess. He wasn't very interested in Africa the last time. He was quite insulting. He never visited, but neither has Biden. But there's a feeling that AGOA may be in jeopardy if Trump comes in and if the House and the Senate return Republican majorities, because it is seen in some Republican circles as non-reciprocal. Well, as it is non-reciprocal, but that there's not enough advantage to the US from AGOA. So, Bob, I think I'll end my remarks there, and we'll be happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and good to see you. Thanks for those remarks. Our next presenter will be Phil Molefe, and if Stephen and Bob are colleagues, Phil and I are almost colleagues, because for years when he was at SABC as head of news and then as acting CEO and head of SABC International, we worked together to bring more South African television programs to the United States. So it's good to see you again, and the floor is now yours, Phil.
Thank you, Adam. I hope I'm clear enough. Good afternoon to everyone. I think Steve has summed up some very important points around the government of national unity. It is important to make this point that the government of national unity in 1994 was more by choice and design. The ANC government had a majority, but in the spirit of national unity, and particularly President Mandela, there was the view that the opposition parties should also be invited into government, because it was at the time of reconciliation and national unity. So that is the perspective on the government of national unity in 1994, more by choice and design. The 30 years later, the government of national unity this time around, however, is a manifestation of the election results in May 2024. It is an expression of the will of the electorate. The electorate did not give any political party an outright majority. So which means the parties had to work together. There was no choice, it was no design of any party in government. They were compelled, so to speak, to work together. What could be the future for the government of national unity? I think, in my view, the very first step was quite critical, that who do you include or who do you exclude? And at the very outset, the ANC, which had more votes than other parties represented in parliament or in Congress, in your language, the ANC elected to invite all the parties that had been elected, that had gained the seats in the Congress. To me, that was a more strategic move to invite everyone. because as we have seen in other coalitions at other levels of government, where you have a coalition of 1 plus 2 other parties, it is an unstable and very vulnerable arrangement. Because if one party threatens to walk away, that actually collapses that government of national unity. So this time around, all the parties were invited to participate. However, 2 parties elected not to be part of the government of national unity. And these are the EFF and the recently formed party led by Jacob Zuma, the Umkhonto Wesizwe Party, MKP. Now, these 2 parties, in my view, had made demands that were quite difficult for other players to meet. For example, the EFF had insisted that they would only participate in the government of national unity only on condition that the Democratic Alliance was not part of that formation. Now, if you are seeking to unite the country, particularly after the electorate had told you that you have to work together, no one has an outright majority, it becomes therefore very difficult to say one major player should not be part of the coalition agreement. The MK party, on the other end, made what I think it was an unreasonable demand. They said the ANC would have to drop their own president. Now you can imagine in the case of the US, although very unlikely, if you were to have a coalition government, then the Republicans say the Democrats must drop their leader. It is highly unlikely. So these 2, in my view, excluded themselves, and then the process went ahead. An important thing about the government of national unity is that when this was negotiated, a statement of intent was negotiated and agreed upon. And this statement of intent is an overarching agreement on how this government of national unity will be managed. One of the key features of this statement of intent, and it is good that it has been approved, is that there will be a dispute resolution mechanism. So a dispute resolution mechanism puts in place a system where if disagreements arose among members of the government of national unity, the government would not be disrupted. The government would continue to operate while the mechanism is attending to those issues that are raising some disagreements within the party. My last point, and Steve touched on that, is foreign policy. In my view, foreign policy is going to remain untouched because South Africa's foreign policy is largely premised on the constitutional principles. And all the parties in the government of national unity have committed to constitutional principles and the rule of law. So what I see play out is the foreign policy that we have seen in South Africa in the last few years, or in fact, quite some time, will continue. What needs to be managed, and particularly in the backdrop of AGOA, is going to be the US-South Africa relations. Now, that one is going to come in for very, very interesting times to watch closely. with the US elections now on the cards, and whether the Democrats or the Republicans are in the White House, in my view, that will also give an indication which way AGOA is most likely to go. I was in Washington in September to attend a board meeting at Howard University. And I know that when I was there, these issues were raised and Biden was still in the running at the time. And the issue that was raised was how does Biden ensure that he wins back the African American constituency in Africa, in the US. And one of the things they were suggesting he needs to do is also to show that he has a more friendlier disposition towards Africa. And issues were raised even about his visits to the continent and so on. So that gave me an indication where things are most likely to go, whether it's a Democrat in the White House or the Republicans. And I quite agree with Steve. If it is Donald Trump in the White House, AGOA will certainly come under a very severe review. But the other way around, we may see a continuation of what is currently in place. South Africa and the United States engaging continuously to see where are the differences and how do we make up for that, a strategy of reapproachment. So I think those are the 2 points I wanted to put forward for now, and I can come back later. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks very much, Phil. You've given us quite a bit of fodder to chew on. Before we come to my senior colleague, Anton Harber, let's first hear from Paul Nantulya, who is a fellow researcher on matters to do with South Africa, African geopolitics. And Paul, I think I wanted to sharpen our points of discussion a little more. Phil and following Steve has pointed out that South Africa's foreign policy and international relations is unlikely to change. And Phil particularly pointed out that the foreign policy is based on constitutional principles, which we know as, pursuance of human rights and the policy of non-alignment, a heavy focus on Africa, the Africa policy, as adhering to a rule-based international system, and within it, pursuing this agenda of global reforms at the UN and in other institutions, including reform of the global financial architecture, which South Africa thinks is unfair, imbalanced, and unsustainable. Given all these issues, where do you see South Africa's relations going with the US in the coming days, particularly also factoring in the whole idea of South Africa as a global South power? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bob, dear friend of mine. And thank you to the previous panelists. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with all of you. And thank you to the audience. I notice people in the audience that I've worked with, and I'm very grateful to be able to speak to some of these issues. This is my third or fourth panel on South Africa over the past month or so. So I feel like I've gone back to living in my country because I grew up in South Africa as a young man. That's where I got my first job. That's where I learned how to live on my own. My first apartment, learning how to cook. Basically, South Africa was very formative for me as a young man, growing up into the professional that I became, or that I think I became later on. So this is it's like a homecoming for me to have participated in so many South African panels this past month or so. Look, when it comes to foreign policy, I share Phil's assessment, and the assessment that was given before, I think by Stephen, one of your colleagues down there. I don't see much change in South Africa's foreign policy for three reasons. First, it is a policy, yes, it follows constitutional principles. Absolutely, we all agree with that. But it is a policy where, I mean, the ANC, particularly the International Relations Department of the ANC, as well as the Portfolio Committee on Foreign Affairs within the South African National Assembly, really play an outsized role when it comes to framing the main themes of South Africa's foreign policy. So that means that South Africa's foreign policy really reflects the positions, the global positions, the international relations positions of the African National Congress and the other members of the Congress Alliance, namely COSATU, to some extent the South African Communist Party, and others. So this is unlikely to change. And given the pressures that we have seen being exerted by COSATU and SACP on the ANC's decisions in terms of its coalition partners, because some are calling this a coalition, they're not calling this a government of national unity, in particular the Democratic Alliance, I don't see a situation where the ANC moves ahead without taking on board the positions and the views of COSATU and the South African Communist Party, who are very unhappy with the participation of the Democratic Alliance in these arrangements. I mean, they made that very clear from the very beginning. So I don't see the ANC not wanting to take their views on board. And when we look at the, if we listen very, very carefully to the address, the foreign policy address that was given by Minister Lamola at the South African Institute of International Affairs, yes, the delivery and the tone was quite different from Naledi Pandor, but the substance was the same. He outlined similar themes: South Africa's uncompromising position on the Israel-Palestine conflict, South Africa's positions on the International Criminal Court and the ICJ, of which Minister Lamola was one of the architects, right? He shepherded that process. South Africa's positions on Western Sahara, South Africa's engagement within BRICS, and South Africa's prioritization of Global South and Africa engagement. These positions have not changed. South Africa's demands for changing of the structures of the international system, these are as old as the post-1994 ANC, perhaps even as old as the ANC itself. The ANC has always, in its literature, in its official party literature, talked about its views on international affairs. So from that perspective, I really don't see much change in South Africa's foreign policy direction. I attended a panel, and I think, Bob, you were there, and some colleagues some colleagues articulated a view that the departure of Naledi Pandor meant that South Africa's foreign policy would now be more muted, would be a little bit, friendlier to, I would say, actually, let me just quote directly, to the Western and the American perspective. I think that's a fundamental misreading of the ANC. I think the institutionalization and entrenchment of certain positions with the ANC are part and parcel of the architecture of the ANC's worldview, regardless of who is in a position of influence to drive South Africa's foreign policy, whether that is the Minister of Foreign Affairs or the head of the ANC's International Relations Department. I think individuals come and go, but there are certain positions in the ANC that are entrenched, and which have a lot to do with the ANC's own evolution, right? I mean, this is a party that was formed before the Bolshevik revolution in Russia. It is older than the Communist Party of China, right? It's the oldest liberation movement on the continent. So it has certain traditions, very strong anti-imperialist bent within it, very, very strong policy of what it calls internationalism and international solidarity. And international solidarity is basically a euphemism for engagement with non-Western or perhaps even sort of leftist, sort of left of center political organizations and countries. This is not going to change, but that does not mean that South Africa, that South Africa's foreign policy is not pragmatic. I mean, there are pragmatists also within the ANC. Yes, it's true that there are those that really push very, very strong ideological positions, but the ANC is also very pragmatic, right? We look at the relationship that Thabo Mbeki, for instance, developed with Al Gore. When both of them were vice presidents of their respective countries, and the South Africa-US Binational Commission did a lot of work during Mbeki's time. In fact, that's the period in which the South African National Defense Force began training with the US military, right? And there are many institutions in South Africa, right, that understudied US institutions. For instance, the Hawks understudied the FBI, right, for quite quite significant amount of time, right? So there's a sense of pragmatism as well that I think will also continue, right, under the current governing arrangement. The final thing that I would say is, as Phil pointed out, the tools and the instruments of foreign policy really in these negotiations, the ANC really tried very hard to keep the DA away from them, from ministries that really advance foreign policy making, and there are actually some who believe that actually the ANC got a lot more out of these negotiations than the DA. The ANC really wanted. We see an ANC that understands that its majority has dwindled, but nevertheless, it's an ANC that is still in the jacket of being a hegemonic and dominant party. We see this even in the domestic realm. It was very interesting for me to watch the parliamentary proceedings that that elected John Schlope onto the Judicial Service Commission, the same body that removed him from misconduct. This was a move in which we saw the ANC, the EFF, and Umkhonto we Sizwe coming together to elect this particular individual, right? The ANC's push to invite as many parties as possible into the governing arrangement. Helen Ziller was very unhappy about that. In fact, she was on an interview and she said, listen, according to articles of the minute that was negotiated between the two sides, the DA's views on inclusion of more members into the GNU, some are calling it, required a no objection on the DA side, but the ANC just went ahead, anyway, and invited other parties. I guess what the ANC wants to do is to just push back against some pressure that is coming from different circles that are basically casting the ANC, quote unquote, as a sellout for having basically sold out to the Democratic Alliance. So when we look at the domestic side and we look at the international side, we really see much of the same. Different individuals, yes, but I think the entrenched positions that the ANC has taken for a very long time as Africa's oldest liberation movement, I think will remain. I think that in terms of moving forward, the two sides, South Africa and the United States, I think the United States needs to do a little bit of more homework to really understand what the ANC is all about, and to understand that certain positions, because the ANC is also not monolithic. There are many, many different elements within the ANC that push sometimes even diametrically opposed positions. This is not new. This has been there right from the very beginning, right? But I think that the US would be better off adopting a posture that does not push the ANC into a position where the ANC is kind of operating in a lager, where it looks at the United States and treats the United States as a party that is as a country that is essentially trying to overthrow certain core tenets, core foreign policy tenets of the party. So I think there needs to be open and frank discussions on both sides. Finally, the ANC, also in terms of foreign policy, is going to be looking at gaining ground. When one talks to colleagues close to ANC circles, to try and understand what is the ANC's thinking on this governing arrangement, one gets the perspective that the ANC is looking at this fundamentally as ground that it has lost to its splinter parties, primarily the Umkhonto we Sizwe Party and the EFF. And if we look at all the election cycles of South Africa, right, starting from the Thabo Mbeki period, we have seen that every time you have a splinter, the ANC's, as a party, the ANC's share of the vote dwindles in proportion, right? And if we look at the 2024 results, if we combine the ANC vote, the EFF vote, and Umkhonto we Sizwe vote, we find that it constitutes about 65%, which is still a majority within the South African electorate, right? And that basically raises the question, what exactly were South Africans voting for? Were South Africans voting for fundamental overhaul of the South African political system? Or were South Africans unhappy, i.e. the majority of South African voters, were they unhappy with the ANC's deviation from certain core programs, for instance, like land reform and restitution and so on, right? So the ANC will want to recapture some of that lost ground. And we do know that within the EFF and within Umkhonto we Sizwe, for instance, if one looks at the foreign policy perspective, I mean, in party meetings together with the ANC, they are wearing, Palestinian regalia, Palestinian scarves, and so on. Very, very clear in terms of engagement with Palestinian organizations, and very, very insistent that South Africa must continue to push, for instance, on the BRICS front. I found it very interesting, for instance, to see that the ANC lost very little time to deploy Kgalema Motlanthe, the former president, to China to meet with the top leadership of the international department of the Communist Party of China, which we all know drives China's foreign policy, not the foreign ministry of China. And if one looks at how that meeting was reported in the Chinese press, it was basically South Africa, the ANC, trying to reassure China that the party-to-party work, the engagement with the Communist Party of China would not suffer as a result of the changes in South Africa, right? So I think that was also a very clear indication that the policy, by and large, will remain the same. The delivery and the tone might be different, but some of these policy positions are deeply entrenched in the ANC. And as we see an ANC trying to recapture the ground that has been lost by these parties that have basically reduced its majority to below 40%, which are essentially splinter parties of the ANC, a lot of those foreign policy positions are going to remain the same. A lot of South Africans like to say that domestic and foreign policy are basically two distinct pillars, but there's a lot of convergence between domestic and foreign policy positions. And I think as the ANC tries to regain some of its lost ground, it will try and protect as much as possible its foreign policy equities and its positions on the kind of issues we're discussing today. So I think that's what I had to say. And once again, thank you very much for inviting me to this platform.
Thank you, and we'll come back to you on some of these points because you've raised some very interesting views about how the future should play out. Our fourth and final presenter on our program today is Anton Harber, and he had an interesting perspective. Anton, you were the editor of one of the 4 anti-apartheid newspapers, and then after the ANC came to power, you ran a journalism program at Wits, and you remain active in the journalism and education worlds. So Anton, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much. You've had some real experts on foreign policy to speak. So I won't take much time. Unfortunately, I'm going to largely agree with the view that there's unlikely to be a major change in South African policy. But what I would like to do is look at it from trying to develop an understanding of the balance of power in the government of national unity, what's holding it together, and what may lead to it eventually breaking up. And, I think the core issue is that the two key parties are in and making the government of national unity work because they recognize each other and it's in their interests at the moment to do so. That may and is likely to change over time. But I think the question we have to ask is what will be the kinds of issues that are likely to disrupt the government of national unity? I think we have to understand, as has been laid out, the ANC is a dominant party and is therefore likely to set policy and foreign policy and the tone of it. There will certainly be a change of tone with the new minister, but I think it's correct to say that the new minister will certainly not be driving much major change to the policy because it is quite well founded within the ANC and its structures. I think we have to understand the differences in foreign policy between the two major parties in the government of national unity. Broadly speaking, the ANC's pivot, shall we say, towards BRICS as important allies and away from Europe and the US, to the extent that that's been the case, would be something that the DA would disagree with and have disagreed with. But more specifically, as has been pointed out, key points of difference recently have been the invasion of Ukraine, and secondly, what's happening in Israel-Palestine in the Gaza. And these are points of significant difference between the two. There is no question. But what I would say is that it is unlikely that the DA will make these breaking points within the government of national unity. It seems to me they will push for change within the government of national unity. I would be surprised if foreign policy is one of those. I think you will see the ANC largely maintaining its position. I think you will see the DA disagreeing with key elements of that. But will it be something that they decide to make a make or break issue? I think that's highly unlikely. I think we saw in this last election that foreign policy is not a driver of votes in South Africa, as in many countries, such as the US generally. It would affect the Western Cape vote, for example, did not really play through in a major way. I think the ANC, as I say, is deeply rooted in its current foreign policy views. And the DA would argue that there are other local pressing issues on which they would want to push hardest on the ANC. So I think a realistic point of view will see that the government of national unity does not agree on all matters foreign, and that disagreement may well lead to a richer, better debate about foreign policy, and I think that would be a healthy and a good thing. But I don't think it's going to be a key enough issue for it to go further than that. That's my view. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anton. I think you've helped us to bring in this very important perspective of where the DA actually stands on major geopolitical issues. The war in Ukraine, interestingly, the framing is the Ukraine-Russia war from some quarters, but some people actually say it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think Anton, as a media scholar, will understand that how you describe something has very critical meaning. And I think you've also helped us understand the fact that, for instance, the DA's position has actually included the fact that the leader of the DA, John Steenhuisen, actually visited Ukraine as a show of solidarity with the Ukrainians not too long ago. On the other hand, President Cyril Ramaphosa led a delegation to Moscow to try and sue for peace. And non-alignment has generally been considered, South Africa leaning more towards Russia, China as a new axis, and with relations with the US not really on a good standing. We, I think, have listened to our presenters. I'll pose a question very quickly to each one of you, but also we will be happy if the participants, our audience, also chip in. Just raise your hand and we'll kind of acknowledge you, give you an opportunity to pose a question or two. I think first to Stephen, you clearly pointed out that there will be more continuity in terms of South Africa's foreign policy because of the ANC being in power. But there's the other issue of global governance, particularly reform of global institutions, including the financial architecture. And we know that the UN General Assembly is meeting in September, and there is the summit of the future, or summit for the future, particularly with the focus on the international global order on issues of trade and finance. Where do you see these parties going, and will that have an impact beyond just general foreign policy, but financial and business and trade related issues?
Thanks. Look, I think as was outlined by previous speakers, reform of international financial institutions and reform of global governance institutions is a strong and enduring mantra that the ANC has uttered for many, many years. They feel that the global South is neglected, and not without some merit. The South Africa is in line with the African position, the so-called, not the so-called, that's what it's called, the Izulwini consensus, that Africa should have 2 permanent seats on a reformed UN Security Council with a veto. There are at least 3 people trying to get into 2 seats. If you ask me, Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa. One of them would be left out, I would think, if these seats were up for grabs. So I'm not sure how easy it would be for Africa to decide who would get 2 seats on such a council. There's been probably more impetus for a reform of the UN Security Council in the last maybe 2 years than there has been previously for many, many years. It was something that was stuck. I still, though, don't see Britain, France, the US, China, and Russia giving up their veto privileges or admitting other countries on a permanent basis that would have the veto. So while there is some more sentiment for global governance reform, and particularly UN Security Council reform, I don't really think we have a critical mass for that to happen at any point, anytime soon. So briefly, and it's not an area of my expertise, but I don't see South Africa letting up on the calls for global reform of institutions. And it has found very willing partners in Russia and China, in Iran, for that kind of reform to be pushed. So while I don't know if it's going to go anywhere in our lifetime, South Africa certainly on a rhetorical level, on a ideological level, chimes with what Russia and China have been saying about the need for changes in the way that global institutions are run. And yes, it's really going to happen. A lot is going to depend on what happens in November in the US, not only in the White House. I think what happens in Congress is just as important, given the way that those institutions function in the US and in terms of making policy. So I think that is going to, if there's a Trump presidency and a Republican majority, is Trump, on the first day going to reverse all the things that Joe Biden reversed membership of international institutions, paying for various UN agencies, etc., etc. So nobody, I don't think, can say what is going to happen. There's the famous October surprise phenomenon. Well, I think this year it came in June, July with the debate between Trump and Biden, which eventually led to Biden bowing out of the race. So yeah, I don't think there will be a let up there, but I also don't think there'll be very much movement there either.
Right. I think as you're speaking, I'm just thinking of the whole point of South Africa under the ANC pushing very hard on the BRICS end, including on the financial end, support for the BRICS Bank. There's been the talk of a de-dollarization and debates such as those. But we have a board member here, Whitney Schneiderman, who might have a perspective on that. If it's a question, you can pose it to a colleague, but you are welcome to also make a comment. And after that, we'll go to Yul Anderson. And any other colleagues wishing to chime in, you are most welcome to raise your hand. Thank you. And over to you, Whitney.
Thanks so much. Thanks to you and Adam for pulling together this great group. It's been an incredibly rich conversation. Just want to make a couple of comments. One, last week was the U.S. AGOA forum in Washington. It was really, I thought, one of the best. I participated in a number of them. I thought it was one of the best. Minister Tao was here. He was very visible. He gave presentations at the Hudson Institute and the Carnegie Endowment. Both were, I think, quite impactful and conveyed a willingness to listen. And, he's pretty explicit, looking for a reset in the relationship, which I think is exactly the right tone to take. I think as it concerns AGOA, there's no question that AGOA is going to be renewed. The question is, when is it going to be renewed? Will it happen before September 30th, 2025? That was really clear. That came through very clear last week in the meetings with members of Congress. The question of South Africa is obviously front and center. To be honest with you, the U.S. has lived with South Africa's non-alignment foreign policy for 30 years. And there have been high points and there have been low points. No question that it's been more exacerbated since Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the Israeli conflict response to Hamas. But to be honest with you, I see the legislation that Congressman James has introduced as more of saber rattling than anything else. I think calling for a review of South Africa's relations isn't that bad. And I sort of argue the U.S. and South Africa can use a review. I think we often misunderstand where each side is. If there is a Trump presidency, will everything be reversed? Yes, there are a lot of negatives in the Trump presidency, but I would point out that under Trump, the BUILD Act passed Congress, and he signed it, which doubled the size of OPEC and created the U.S. Development Corporation, and Prosper Africa was created. So I think that tone matters, I guess, is where I would leave it. And I think we're seeing a new tone from the government of national unity. I don't think anybody really expects a change of policy from South Africa, but tone matters, and hopefully we can go forward and revitalize the constructive relationship that we had. If Vice President Harris gets elected, I'm sure that will happen. If it's a Trump presidency, it will be harder, no question. But I think we can manage to find a way to maintain the strong relations. So, Bob, I just want to make those comments. I thought it was great conversation, and back to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Whitney. I think you've given us some optimism there that relations can be mended. I did introduce Whitney as a board member of our African Center for the Study of the United States, but he's a long-time analyst, former, U.S. government official on African matters in State Department. And I say this so that as I introduce, I invite Yul Anderson to come in. You may want to also introduce yourself so that we get to know you. I know that quite a number of people on this call are regulars. Many people know each other, but it'd be great for you to introduce yourself as you make your comment or pose a question, and you are most welcome.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. My name is Yul Anderson. I'm the president of the African American Future Society, and I conduct futures analysis on African American movements and social justice initiatives. And I would like to say that we remember the Mount Floor project that took place in South Africa back in 1992, when Nelson Mandela was to be freed. And that incorporated people from the ANC, the PAC, the SACP. And it basically was looking at the future of South Africa from 1992 up through 2002. What we have missed is the gap of the last 22 years leading up from 2002 to 2024. So when we're looking at the future of South Africa-US relations, and from our research, we must remember that there's a huge pressure on job creation and even on social justice movements on the continent. As a result, it leads to civil unrest, it leads to expanded coups, and it also leads to regional integration and merging of various governments and concerns that we're seeing with some of the present leaders today. What we also see is an express movement of African Americans, which was hinted to earlier, of the influence of the diaspora on US-Africa relations. And in essence, we must not forget that the Reverend Leon Sullivan created the Sullivan Principles, which was one of the greatest teardowns of apartheid in South Africa. So there's huge opportunities and movements in the US and the diaspora that will not only impact South Africa in its present condition, but the future of the African continent together. And I think, Mr. Wekesa, you mentioned that the UN's having the Summit of the Future coming up in September in New York. There will be large contingents of Black people asking for changes in governmental financial structures, for partnerships, and for cooperation. And regional government administration and government formations will rise out of increased pressures of injustices on the ground. And so we as African Americans see a huge partnership and movement on social justice, and the quick spread of technology and the ability to move people and masses. Just as we saw the George Floyd incidents creating black swans all across the African continent, we see a continuation and a continued push. And if Kamala Harris wins the presidency of the US, then that opportunity will just get stronger. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you've ended on a note. This is a big point of discussion in South Africa and the rest of the continent as to whether Kamala Harris will win the presidency or it will be a return to the era of Trump. The previous speakers have pointed out that the likelihood of better relations under Trump is being considered, but at the same time, there are those who think that Trump rather will actually portend well for the continent because he will not be too focused on the continent and will give room to South Africa, the continent, to do their own thing, to be independent as it was. So there are discussions on all sides of the divide. But let me also recognize the point you made, which is that the diaspora is a major constituency. South Africa alone has over, some people count over 3,000 African Americans living and working here. We have 600 businesses, many of them owned by African Americans and so forth. So I think that's an important point to consider in terms of South African foreign policy towards the United States, and it will be worth considering. But I think let me come back to Anton Harber and pose the question. I hope it's not an ambush, but there are two sides to the framing of these issues of a foreign policy that is founded on human rights, justice, and an equitable global order. So on the one hand, South Africa says that, but we see clearly that it is in support of Russia, of China, and these are countries that are considered authoritarian, that do not quite respect human rights and so forth. On the other hand, we see a US that is kind of leaning on South Africa not to prosecute Israel at the International Criminal Court. And yet there are questions of Israel's flouting of the human rights of Palestinians. So here we have a kind of a split, geopolitical discussions founded on the issues of human rights, justice, rules, and so forth. What would be your perspective in all this as part of the relations?
Well, you raise an interesting point, and it was exactly the reason I stayed away from the discussion about our foreign policy having to be within the framework of our constitution, which of course would foreground issues of human rights, for example. Because yes, I would imagine both sides of the debate would say they're committed to human rights. But in the case of Ukraine and Gaza, would take a very different view of how one furthers, supports, and backs human rights in those situations. So I don't think the Constitution is enough to keep things together. There will be differences over it, and certainly the ANC has been called out before for not being consistent in its support for international human rights and institutions. And I think that will continue to be the case. But, there's many factors which frame and form foreign policy, and the Constitution is just one of them, because there are many different factors which go into the interpretation of those key elements of the Constitution. So as I said before, I think we're in for a very rich debate, probably enriched by the fact that it will happen between parties in the Government of National Unity. And one should say that one's already seen a flurry or two, and it's interesting to see how they played out. So, for example, in the Department of Sports and Culture, there was a statement issued by from the ministry in the last week, saying that Israel should not be at the Paris Olympics. The minister, who is the member of a minority party in the Government of National Unity, said that he disagreed with that, even though the statement came from his ministry, but he will deal with it not in the midst of the Olympics, but when he gets back to South Africa. And I think there's where you will see careful discussions and debate taking place in an attempt to try and be consistent and coherent in our response to international affairs. But it will have its complications as it did in the last week.
Thanks, Anton. I think we are in for, as you rightly put it, some very vibrant discussions, because there's accusations of doublespeak, both on the South African side and on the US side. They point at each other on very specific, clear, and ambiguous issues where adherence to human rights might not be really something that is being pursued. I wonder if there's any speaker from the audience in Washington, D.C. Maybe they can through Adam make themselves available. But as we do that, I wanted to go to Phil to wonder how you will look at this issue of the potential fallout of US-South Africa relations at the diplomatic level. There's been talk of relations reaching so low a level that, in fact, there's a proper fallout, and that countries, maybe in the immediate or in the medium term or in the future, this country is saying, no, look, we used to be allies, but we agreed to part ways. Are we likely to reach such a point, or is it something that will not necessarily happen? Or if it does happen, how should it be approached? What are the diplomatic avenues, perhaps? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, once again. The US-South Africa relations have been interesting over a number of years. Remember, the United States used to have relations with the apartheid South African government. And when the democratic government came into power in 1994, that position was reviewed, and there was a new relationship developed, and a policy of rapprochement was developed. What does it tell you? It tells you that both countries recognize the role, the significance, and the importance of each country. The United States is aware of the significant role that South Africa plays on the continent. South Africa is a continental power. South Africa is behind the AU. It leads the peacekeeping missions and all that, some of which the United States is involved in. So it is not an easy position to arrive at, to say, I am walking away. So a diplomatic fallout between the United States of America and South Africa is not an easy position to arrive at, because there are complex issues. There are a manifold of interests at play. US is one of the major investors in South Africa, particularly on the continent. And, a diplomatic fallout is something that would be managed carefully. A very good example, and incidentally, I met the US ambassador to South Africa in recent weeks. And a good example is the issue that come into the public space about statements that were made by the US ambassador to South Africa. To use that as an example, you can see how that situation was managed. It was then elevated to another level, and it was dealt with at another level, because both countries recognize the mutual interests they have in the relations they enjoy. So I don't see a diplomatic fallout being something that comes about that easily. And in respect of the government of national unity, where there are apparent disagreements between players within that government of national unity, I think foreign policy does not have the potential of disrupting the government of national unity. As I mentioned, some of these issues will be dealt with in the dispute resolution mechanism, but issues around Russia, Ukraine, Israel, and Palestine, these are not issues that could potentially disrupt the government of national unity, because that government inherently is inward-looking. They are looking at their future electoral success. everybody in that government is looking at opportunities that can be derived from collective successes and individual gains so that the tide can be changed in the next electoral cycle. So your foreign policy issues really do not pose that threat. So on the diplomatic front, as I mentioned, Bob, I think it is a situation that would be managed, and the US and South Africa will remain in these diplomatic relations for a very long time. There can be no fallout where one walks away from the other.
Thank you, Phil. Again, if there's any, Adam, I don't know if there's any comment from the room, but even as we consider that, I wanted to pose a question to Paul. You study the Communist Party of China's relations with African governing parties, particularly liberation movements in Southern Africa, including the ANC. Now we have a situation where the ANC is very close to the CCP, the Communist Party of China, but now is in a coalition with the DA, which is Western inclined by perception or in real terms. What does that mean in terms of even just party-to-party relations? And how does that, because that's already an international affair in and of itself. I'm keen to hear your points.
No, thank you, Bob, and once again, thank you, Philip, thank you, Stephen, Adam, Anton. Really, it's such a pleasure to be on a panel with my South African cultural allies. Look, I think this is something that the ANC has given a lot of thought to, because from the period of the first presidency, the first term of Jacob Zuma, I was looking at the data. I was looking at the data yesterday. I have something coming out. It will probably be published today or tomorrow, precisely on this issue, on the party-to-party relations between the CCP and African parties, in particular liberation movements. And I looked at some of this data. About 78%, which I counted, 78% of the National Executive Committee of the ANC have attended training, party-to-party training in the People's Republic of China, in different institutions. The Chinese Academy of Governance, which is the English name for the CCP Central Party School. Various institutions like the Pudong Senior Cadres College in Shanghai, and many other party schools. Some of that training has taken place in the People's Republic. Some of it has taken place in South Africa. The two parties have a very close relationship. In fact, the ANC, together with the Chama Cha Mapinduzi of Tanzania, have the most intense engagements with the CCP on the African continent. Certainly between 2000, if you look at the data, between 2000 and 2022. So there's a lot of equities. And if you look at the party-to-party agreements that were reviewed and renewed, I think this was 2 years ago. There's a lot in there in terms of the partnership, the institutional partnership and training partnership between the South African National Academy of Governance and the Chinese National Academy of Governance, which of course is the Central Party School. So part of Kgalema Motlante's visit to the People's Republic of China was to talk about what is going to happen to those equities. And it was very interesting because the readout of those meetings mentioned party-to-party work, cadre development, the cadre development activities between the two sides. It is interesting because the ANC is one of those parties that has asked the CCP to build a political school, to train the cadres. Of course, the ANC has its own schools, the Oliver Tambo School of Leadership and so on, which have their relations. So What I suspect is that the ANC, within its within the constraints it's facing within this government of national unity, as it's being called, is going to try and push as much as possible, right, for those relations to remain, because I think the two sides have invested a lot in that relationship. I haven't seen or heard anything regarding, if there might have been any outreach between Halema Motlanthe and maybe other senior ANC or former ANC officials with the Russian side. But certainly on the Chinese side, there's been a lot of back and forth muscle movements. China, I think, was trying to be diplomatic when it said that yes, it supports the ANC, yes, it supports a continuation of, and this was the Vice Minister Chen Zhou from the International Department of the CCP, said that the CCP will continue to support and engage and invest in the relationship with the ANC, but will also support the government of national unity. So that was also very interesting. Are there other parties in the government of national unity that the CCP works with? No, the answer is no. But the CCP does have a relationship with the EFF, has a relationship with the South African Communist Party, has a relationship with COSATU to some extent. So yes, I think I see these elements continuing. But perhaps the final thing I would also want to note is that there's a lot of room, really. There is a lot of room for South Africa and the United States to collaborate, especially on the issues of human rights, democracy, capacity building. I saw this in action during my time in South Africa. I was working for an institution that was working very closely with President Nelson Mandela on the Burundi negotiations. And I can tell you that the US support and involvement in that process was shepherded and mobilized basically by South Africa. South Africa, which brought the US in, brought the US on board, and the US obliged, right? The kind of institutional capacity building work, with the election commission and so on. I mean, yes, the ANC's majority has dwindled. But how many times on the African continent, and I've said this in other forums, how many times on the African continent do we see a ruling party that is on the verge of losing power, that is on the verge of losing its majority, accepting the result, defending the Independent Electoral Commission, and getting into a coalition with minority parties, right? Itself also becoming a minority party. Half the time, you're going to see switching off of the internet, deployment of armored personnel carriers on the streets, the IEC receiving phone calls telling them what results they should announce, or perhaps even delaying the announcement of results. We've seen this in Zimbabwe by over a month, right? Opposition supporters being abducted and so on. That the ANC did not engage in such tactics, I think, is an indication of the bottom-up pressure that continues to exist in South Africa, right? For the strengthening of democratic institutions and the democratic process, right? And I think on those issues, there's a lot of room for coordination and collaboration with the United States, because the United States says that it believes in the same things. I think the United States has no closer partner on the African continent than South Africa when it comes to democratic consolidation. So I would also like to strike a more optimistic tone that there's a tendency by the two sides to focus on the things that divide. And yet the things that bring the United States and South Africa together are quite significant, issues of peacekeeping, issues of supporting elections. I mean, South Africa lent the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2006, lent the Democratic Republic of Congo its electoral machinery, right? So there are lots of areas where the two sides can actually collaborate, and perhaps that should be part of the discussion between Ronald Lamola and his counterpart in the United States. So I think, Bob, you know what? Let me stop there. But I just wanted to throw that out there as a provocative, to inject some fresh thinking into this discussion. Thank you.
No, I think you're absolutely right. South Africa-US relations are the closest of the continent, and even globally, by the fact that businesses, people-to-people relations, so forth, are very tight. They are all democracies and so forth. But I think the question we haven't really come to, and it also it means that as researchers will have to work on, is where will the Democratic Alliance stand when given the ANC's proximity to the CCP and other political formations in Russia. And I think it's still the jury is still out there, but we can look at some of the pointers. Will the DA be ideology agnostic in these circumstances, with the idea that it is more keen on national interest, which is an economic interest? But I think at this point, I would like to invite Mr. Molefe Mbeki, who is both a board member at our center as well as the South African Institute of International Affairs. Over to you, Molefe, and welcome.
Thank you, Bob, and good afternoon, everybody. Well, afternoon to the South Africans and morning to the Americans, I guess. Well, for me, I feel there is a certain air of unreality about our discussion. The reason I'm saying this is because the ANC has been rejected by its core constituency. Why? Because the core constituency that used to vote for the ANC feels that the ANC's policies have failed, both the domestic policies and the foreign policies. That's why the ANC only got 40% of the vote. And if you analyze where it lost its vote, the ANC lost the vote of the Black or African working class in the metros. They are the ones it lost. It lost the vote of the Black or African middle class in the metros. The ANC is now a party of the poor in the peri-urban areas and in the rural rural areas. So we are spending a lot of energy about. It has rightly been pointed out that in the maneuvering for the creation of the government of national unity, the ANC has managed to keep the portfolio of foreign affairs. But we're talking about a party whose policies have failed in the eyes of its own constituencies. South Africa, the ANC's policies of antagonism to the United States that do not necessarily have the support of the African working class or the African middle class. That is a fact. So we are talking about failed policies here. The ANC's domestic policies have failed. We are sitting with 42% unemployment in South Africa. So that's why I think both Adam and Bob have to try and re-guide our discussion towards a realistic discussion rather than an unrealistic discussion. The ANC is a failed party. The voters gave it 30 years to solve South Africa's problems. It failed, and they have now rejected it. And whoever wants to partner with the ANC, well, you are welcome. But the ANC is not coming back. With the failure of its domestic policies and its foreign policies, the core constituents of the ANC is not going to go back and vote for the ANC. The ANC, in fact, this week is conducting a huge evaluation of why it lost its majority. So it knows itself. So we kind of, in a way, if I can be unkind, we are flogging a dead horse here. So can we try our leaders in this lead us to address realistic issues rather than the dead horse, which really is what the ANC is to South Africa today. Of course, dying horses don't die instantly; they take a long time. But the ANC is very clearly not the future of South Africa. Thank you.
Well, let's see if I may jump in. It's very interesting because you're raising some pretty central questions about where South Africa is going politically, but also domestically as well as in foreign policy. How should foreign policy reflect South Africa's domestic economic needs? I mean, you refer to 22% unemployment, but there are other indices that are pretty weak. How would you recommend that South African foreign policy change to enhance South Africa's domestic situation?
Thanks, Adam. You see, if I take just a few steps back, in the 1980s, we the South Africans, we had huge support from the United States population, both black and white population in the United States. When I say huge, I mean huge. This population in the United States supported us in a fight against apartheid, and it gave us the comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act sanctions against the apartheid regime on the veto, against the veto of Ronald Reagan. It overrode by both Democrats and Republicans, it overrode the veto of Ronald Reagan and imposed sanctions on South Africa, on the apartheid regime in South Africa. What happened to the ANC once it got to power? It completely ignored this huge goodwill and support that we had in the United States. It instead of nurturing and developing the support, it allowed, for example, for the collapse of Trans-Africa. We should never have allowed Trans-Africa to collapse. We should have supported financially for Trans-Africa to continue, because it was an important support mechanism. We should have done what Israel is doing. Israel is supporting its constituency in the United States. We should also have supported our constituency in the United States. So that is one of the most important failures of the ANC's foreign policy, is allowing this massive constituency that our country had in the United States to just slip away, to the extent that we now are sitting with a resolution in the House of Representatives supported by 68 Democrats for the Biden administration to review. Now, it was the Democrats and Biden himself who drove the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act and the overriding of Ronald Reagan. So we should be having 3, 4, 5 times the investment in South Africa from the United States to what we're having today. I don't know if I'm answering your question, Adam.
No, I think we hear you, Molefe. I think it's a very stunning, forthright, frontal perspective. You are not beating about the bush. You are saying ANC's days are numbered. And that, I think, gives us pause as how to relate with the ANC in the current coalition government, or how to look at, if you are an American, how do you approach the fact that the ANC, like other African liberation movements, is going down? I think it gives us a new, more explicit, as you're saying, more realistic levels of assessment.
Yul Anderson, you have your hand raised also.
Hi, thank you again so much. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here with you. Um, Mr. Mbeke shared a couple of things that we see impacting not only South Africa and U.S. relations, but the entire continent itself. And we mentioned, he mentioned there's a 42% unemployment rate in South Africa. And this unemployment will be shaping Africa's future as we sit here today. Africa needs about 18 million new jobs annually to absorb the large numbers of youth entering the labor market. We see the youth already operating without borders as they seek jobs and sustainability and as they are able to use technology to advance themselves across the continent. While we're looking at US-South Africa relations, we see that the South African government, as well as other African countries, as in the past, are just using whatever relationships that are available to them first. And the even Mr. Gruzd, his organization has a China Africa toolbox on their website where they are looking at the China-African relations. And unfortunately, there are some things that the Chinese and Russia can do in Africa that the United States cannot do. So, we're just basically seeing a collapse of many government structures on the continent as this new scramble for Africa is taking place with the use and advance of technology, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Yul. I think let's try again, Ambassador Dr. Brefo.
Thank you very much. Is it okay now?
It's better, it could be better, but at least we can hear you, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to just be brief on the foreign policy of South Africa in relation to the coalition government or the unity government. And basically, the ANC is in charge of the foreign ministry, it's in charge of the finance, it's in charge of the home affairs. So basically, the foreign policy might not necessarily be changed. And let's remember, South Africa and United States relation in terms of foreign policy. South Africa is a sovereign state. They have their way of thinking. As I bring in Israel, Hamas war as a case study, they have their way of thinking of prosecuting Netanyahu of a war crime at The Hague. They cannot be thinking alike with the United States because South Africa have their way of thinking. It's a sovereign state. They have reason of making their foreign policies. But the most important thing is that all the foreign policies that should be initiated with the coalitional government has to be a policy that will influence economic development of South Africa. A policy that can bring job and growth. A policy that can bring empowerment to the youth. If any policy that comes, which might not bring economic development, social development, and other infrastructure development, which will bring the well-being of South Africa, they might not get the actual impact. So arguably, the foreign policies of South Africa are going to, a status quo are going to remain safe because ANC is not in charge. Though it's a coalitional government, though it's a unity government, but it has been categorized where every party should work for. So I bet to say that they should look at policies which will bring in-house growth, especially in the finance, the BRICS that they want to de-dollarize, the BRICS Bank that their coalition that they have formed, all those policies, which of them is bringing the economic development, youth empowerment, growth, eradication of poverty. All this is what South Africa should be looking at. The internal house, internal economic affairs, which will bring relief to the people of South Africa. This is where the coalitional government should sit down and draw a chart and make possible development for people in South Africa to get positive impact of the unity government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bref. I think you propounded the need to focus on economics, and I know that there are people, some analysts who have pointed out that if the US wants to be relevant to South Africa, it is in the economic sphere that the focus should be directed. Maybe there is a confluence of interest there because of the severe decline of the economy. Some have gone as far as saying South Africa actually needs a Marshall Plan, and that the US in the past has been pivotal in supporting economies such as the Japanese, South Korean, economies in the past. But and such a model could be used in building relations with South Africa. But over to you, Paul. I can see your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Bob. I'll be brief. Let me associate myself with the comments of Molefe Mbeki as it relates to the constituencies that South Africa enjoyed in the United States. There's no question about that. If we look at, we could say that that constituency was concentrated within the structures of the Congressional Black Caucus. And the Congressional Black Caucus, I would say yes. If South Africa is guilty, if the ANC is guilty of not having paid enough attention to sustaining that constituency, and where we have seen the effect of that, where you have what should be a natural constituency for South Africa, pushing for a review of South Africa relations, that is definitely a clear indicator. But I think the same can also be said about the other side. Right? I remember during my time in South Africa, the Congressional Black Caucus sent every year big delegations to South Africa to engage different parts of the country, the government, the parliament, academic institutions. It was really, there was a good, effort on the part of the Congressional Black Caucus to try and keep some of those links alive. It seems to me that that kind of fell by the wayside. People like the late John Lewis and others, they were very, it was a very, very close relationship. But I think certainly it doesn't seem to me from where I sit that the CBC continued to prioritize keeping that relationship strong and enduring. So I think it's a two-way. I think it's a two-way dynamic. When it comes to certain critical foreign policy issues, the Congressional Black Caucus, you hardly hear of the caucus. Yes, they do have an international committee, an international affairs committee within its structure. But it's really not and actually, even on this issue of the GNU, the South African election and everything, I've tried to look for comment from the CBC. Did they send a delegation to the elections and so on? I haven't found anything. So a lot of that has died away. And I think Molefe Mbeki makes a good point that when we talk about South Africa, US relations, we tend to focus on, State Department and DIRCO, but there was a lot underneath that relationship, I think, that was lost, particularly after 1994. Perhaps it's time to review it. I don't know, but certainly I would agree that the two sides haven't really invested as much as they invested before, prior to the dismantling of formal apartheid in the country.
Thanks, Paul. I think the interesting point you make here is that the relations between the ANC-led South Africa and the US, various constituencies in the US have weakened. But it's interesting that over the same period, relations with particularly China have strengthened. Relations with Russia were always there. But with China, in fact, they were almost on the floor. but they have expanded so much. So it's almost as if you look at weakening of relations in one direction, strengthening towards China, which is an interesting point you make. And I also just want to observe that in September, the Congressional Black Caucus meets annually in September. Perhaps, this will be an opportunity for mending fences if it were possible. But at this point, we are coming to just 10 minutes to closure. I wanted to give an opportunity to any one of the speakers to chime in, to make any comments. Phil, Stephen, any concluding remarks, then we'll be moving towards wrapping up.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. In my opening remarks, I did allude to moves that were underway to try and stimulate, particularly the African American constituency in the US, to get more involved, but also to get the administration closer to that constituency. It's a very important constituency because it's the African diaspora. And Paul is quite right about the involvement of the Congressional Black Caucus, particularly in harnessing the relations between South Africa and the United States. And this is the discussion we also had in April. I said mistakenly in September. No, in April this year. This is the discussion that was raised even in Washington about how do we actually ensure even the incumbent administration gets closer to the African American constituency, but also particularly the Black Caucus and the continent of Africa. And I think the prospects, although that is something that the US electorate will decide on, the prospects of Kamala Harris assuming office can also contribute quite significantly to the revitalization of that constituency. Equally important, it's the white section of the population in the United States, because it is a very, very strong and economically powerful constituency. So there has to be that revitalization of relations at that level. And it should not just be left to the State Department and South Africa's International Relations Department. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Phil. I think you make a good point of finding other avenues of engagement with the US. I think I'm saying other avenues advisedly, because as Molefe told us, we have to start rethinking the ANC's longevity in power over the next couple of years. If Molefe is right, then we are going to see the end of ANC. But if he's wrong, then we might still reckon with the ANC for a longer period of time. I'm not too sure. But I think the point you make is that we might need other avenues, people to people, university to university, businesses, cultural engagements, and so forth. So it's interesting to consider. But over to you, Stephen, to give us your closing remarks.
Thank you. So Molefe is the chairman of the South African Institute of International Affairs, where I work. And I remember so distinctly when Cyril Ramaphosa came in, Molefe was at a briefing and he said, you know, this guy is going to disappoint you. He's going to be weak and indecisive. And so take what he says quite seriously. But no, thank you. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I just want to refer again to that opinion piece that Deputy Minister Wekesa wrote. And he said, you know, why is South Africa being singled out by Congress? other countries are also not aligned and taking these sorts of positions, like India, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey were the ones that he mentioned. That doesn't excuse what you're doing at home, but it does also show, I think, how complex these issues become, and that there are selections and political choices made. We don't see a bill wanting to review Saudi Arabia's relations with the US, for example. So I think for us who work in the foreign policy field, it is going to be an interesting few years. People are watching very, very closely what the minister says, what the deputy minister says. And Anton's absolutely right. There is a storm brewing between, in the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, the deputy minister from the ANC and the Patriotic Alliance minister there. And maybe that's the first sign that this government of national unity is going to show cracks. But I also agree with Anton that it will be held together by, these are not going to be the issues that break the unity of the government. There may well be other ones, but it's unlikely to be a foreign policy issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And as you're talking, I was just thinking of the fact that the national and provincial elections are over, but we are looking at the local government elections coming up in 2026. So all the parties in the government of national unity must already be strategizing on how to undercut each other within even the government of national unity. And I think we suspect that there will be a ramping up of contestation within the GNU as we enter 2025, at which point in time we'll have either someone new in the White House or the elevation of another, in this case, Kamala Harris. Paul, I wonder if you have any last comment before I turn it over to Adam. Yeah.
No, I think I said what what I wanted to say, and once again to just thank you very much for inviting me on this forum. It feels like home, and it's been a privilege and an honor. Thank you so much.
Thanks, and without further ado, let me hand over to Adam in DC to take us to the conclusion of this. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Bob, and thanks to all of our speakers and all those who joined for questions and comments. The outlook is rather interesting because just as in so many other democracies, there is no one voice, political voice, that has sufficiently wide support to really move forward without forming, in this case, in South Africa, a coalition, the government of national unity. But it's not clear who in that government has the power to succeed. And I think that the ANC has had 3 decades now of being in power, and well, let's put it rather bluntly, a little earlier. So thanks to all of you who have joined us online. Thanks to all of you here in Washington, D.C. We've had some interesting first-time guests who chose not to join the conversation. Just a reminder that our next forum will be on Monday, August 26th. At the same time, topic will be intergenerational solidarity and African health. You can see the list of forums for the entire year, all of 2024, on our website. And in addition, the videos of our prior Africa-US forums are there, and the video of this program also will be posted there. So again, our thanks to all of you online, our thanks to all of you here in Washington, and until August 26th, we're adjourned.